Landlords in Minnesota believe that rent control is the worst possible solution that you could propose. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over one of my favorite issues, rent control. Now, as you know, I am not a fan of rent control or any kind of government controls on markets because I believe that rent control actually makes housing more expensive. It actually exacerbates the problems. So in a prior video that I actually created a video that was going over the fact that the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, was trying to, enact rent control within the city limits. Well, since I put that story out, now the city of Minneapolis is also trying to implement rent control. So we've got the two largest cities in the state of Minnesota trying to put in a policy that has been proven not to work all over the country, all over the world. Okay, so I'm really kind of worried about the way things are going. And, we could see this sort of rent control issue spread throughout the entire country. And it would be a nightmare for landlords, for real estate developers, and for everybody because it just makes things worse, okay? But before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below, and let me know what you think of rent control, okay? I've asked you this question before, but just in case you didn't respond in my last video, what do you think of rent control? Do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea? So, this article comes from MinnesotaReformer.com, and it says, Landlords, realtors, and carpenters launch anti-rent control campaign in Twin Cities. Let's see what it says. Groups representing landlords, realtors, and union laborers urged voters in Minneapolis and St. Paul to reject rent control ballot initiatives, saying they will hamstring development amid an ongoing housing shortage. The answer to affordability is supply, and this will have a chilling effect on supply, said Adam Duenick, Director of Government Affairs for the North Central Regional Council of Carpenters and former chair of the Metropolitan Council. And I absolutely agree, okay? So rent control, it makes it so that developers, they don't want to developers, they don't want to build new buildings because they know that they won't be able to get a return on them. Okay, they won't be able to get a return that makes it worth creating the investment. Landlords won't want to buy properties. They won't want to do maintenance because the profit margins are so low. I mean, it makes things worse, and it's so unbelievable to me that the tenant advocates, they don't even look and see what economists say. The grand majority of economists agree that rent control is bad, okay? And they haven't even read this research. They go and they're basically going off of a purely emotional response. And, if we keep the rents the same, people will be able to afford, to stay in their places. And the problem is, we need natural turnover. We need people to continue to move in and out of buildings. We need more development, more supply if we want prices to remain lower. And, it is unbelievable that they still haven't figured this out. Proponents of the rent stabilization measures argue that even with efforts to increase development, many low-income renters are subject to exploitative rent hikes and have no legal recourse. The newly formed coalition of businesses and labor interests announced their campaign, Think Twice About Rent Control, on Tuesday in front of the Carpenters Local 322 Union Hall in St. Paul. Their pitch? Rent control will backfire by exacerbating the housing shortage as developers look elsewhere to build new homes and landlords convert their units to condos or owner-occupied homes. And that's exactly what landlords are going to do, okay? They're going to find the best way that they can make money without having to deal with rent control, which is, convert over to condos and sell to owner-occupants. That's exactly what happened in all the other places throughout the country where rent control was implemented, okay? You can look back at the past and see all the condo conversions that happened, and it was disastrous for the affordable housing because it just basically disappeared. If we're looking for solutions to affordable housing affordability, then rent control is probably the worst solution one could propose, says Cecil Smith, CEO and president of the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association, a trade group for property managers. Smith said some investors have paused buying properties until after Election Day in case the ballot initiatives pass. Markets react to regulation, and they're acting soundly and reasonably and rationally because the measure in St. Paul is draconian, Smith said. Yeah, and that's the truth. Okay, so politicians, what they'll do is they'll put a measure into place, and they'll always talk about the best result as though we have no control over anything. They're like, well, landlords will just be forced to accept lower rent. No, we're not, okay? We can convert over to condos. We can sell to owner occupants, or we could just take things off of the market completely and repurpose them for other uses. I mean, you never know what exactly is going to happen. But keep in mind that we're running businesses here, and we're going to do what's best for our businesses, and that's not always the same thing as what's best for the tenants. So the tenants could be left high and dry with less affordable properties, less places to rent overall, just because of something like this being put into place. And that's exactly what happened in places like New York even, okay? So yeah, there's a ton of rent controlled units there, but getting a nice low cost rent controlled unit isn't easy. It's very, very difficult for people to find a nice low cost rent controlled unit. And the reason is because there's such a shortage of them, because nobody wants to be under this rent control. They're not building new properties at the rate they need to keep up with the demand. So there's a huge shortage of affordable housing in places like New York and places in California where they have rent control. The ordinance proposed in St. Paul is one of the most stringent in the country, limiting rent increases to 3% annually without exemptions for new construction. Landlords also would not be able to raise rents beyond 3%, even between renters. The St. Paul proposal of a maximum 3% annual increase would be among the lowest caps in the country. California and Oregon, for example, allow annual increases of 5% plus inflation and 7% plus inflation, respectively. Advocates say it's less than the median rent increase over the past 20 years in Minneapolis. Yeah, it's really saying something when you're saying, hey, this is going to be more strict than what they're doing up in Portland and more strict what they're doing in California. I mean, that's really saying something, okay? So that's how crazy this is. And it doesn't exempt new construction either. So when you build a brand new apartment building, there's no way you can raise rents more than this 3%. So what exactly are you going to do if you own a brand new or if you build a brand new apartment building? You're going to make the initial rent so high that no poor or lower income people will even be able to afford to live there. You're only going to be able to deal with luxury and high-end apartments. So this isn't going to help the lower income people at all. The only thing it's going to do is hurt them. Okay, how many times do I have to say rent control doesn't work? Okay, it is a completely flawed system. Unlike St. Paul, Minneapolis does not allow voters to pass ordinances through referendum, so it's following a two-step process. If approved, the ballot initiative would allow the Minneapolis City Council to draft a rent control ordinance, which it could either enact or put before voters in 2022. Under state law, cities may only enact rent control if approved by voters in a general election. Rent control is a politically dicey issue in both cities that can divide even progressive voters. St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter has resisted taking a position on the ballot initiative, while a slim majority of St. Paul council members have quietly come out against it in recent weeks. So the only check and balance they really have is the fact that if you want to implement rent control, then it has to come up to a vote by the people. Unfortunately, though, in places like St. Paul and many cities throughout the country, probably the majority of people within the city limits are renters, okay? I know that's the case in Kansas City, where I'm from, where the majority of the people who live in the city limits are actually renters. So they might actually pass this rent control, not knowing about the economics of the situation, not knowing about the costs or what it could, do to the developers and the landlords, etc. They might pass this thinking of this best case scenario, not realizing that it's actually harming them instead. So there is a possibility that this could pass just by a simple vote. But that is why we have city councils and mayors, etc., because sometimes they have to make tough decisions that are for the good of the city that aren't always 100% in line with what the voters want, okay? Councilmember Jane Prince was the sole council member to join the group in front of the Carpenters Union Hall to show her opposition to the ballot initiative. She said the policy going before voters in St. Paul is too severe. It suggested she would be supportive of a policy tied to inflation and with exemptions for new construction. The problem is that what is before the voters in St. Paul is a very blunt instrument, Prince said. The ordinance would cover properties at all income levels. For the life of me, I can't understand why we would be putting rent control in higher income luxury apartments. Well, I disagree with this council member, okay? We don't need rent control at all. They don't need rent control in the city of St. Paul at all. It doesn't matter if they carve out other little exemptions or whatever, or tie it to inflation or whatever. It's still bad policy, period. Okay? And she doesn't realize that. Yeah, she's trying to play both sides. Oh, yeah, I'm against this measure, but I support rent control. Well, you have to really look at the economics to understand. And you obviously have never owned a property before. You've never been a developer before. You don't understand what goes into these type of projects and why rent control is so detrimental. Okay, you also don't understand that the real cause behind housing being unaffordable isn't like we're just, raising our rents just because, we're greedy. Okay, everything increases in price. Okay, look how much inflation has been this year in the United States. I heard it was over 5%. Well, the St. Paul rent control limits rent increases to 3%. So inflation went up 5%. You could only increase rents by 3%. You've already lost 2% because of inflation alone. Isn't that crazy? So yeah, this is a horrible, horrible idea. And I'm totally against rent control in every situation. And I hope that these landlords, they get on the ball, they get enough support so that they never pass this ridiculous law.